All right, Dina Fainberg has just released a book called Cold War Correspondents. I wasn't a Cold War correspondent because I went to Russia in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I would like to think that we reported neutrally, or as neutral as anybody could be. And I have to check myself now because I've read a few chapters of Dina's book, and she says, no matter how open you want to be, you tend to come at these things with your cultural values and your background, so you won't always report as neutrally as you think. And I'm going to ask you about that, Dina, in a second. But anyway, I think we certainly weren't controlled by the State Department. We weren't controlled by anybody but our editors in New York in terms of script approval. And then when you read this book, Dina, it's pretty eye-opening that you've broken this mold or perception that I had, that American media was free, open, and fair, and that the Soviet media was controlled by the Kremlin. It wasn't as simple as that.
No, it was way more complex. And like you mentioned, there were people on both sides who came to these posts in the Soviet Union or in the United States with their perceptions, their ideological values, their backgrounds, things that they considered interesting. And so something that was really interesting for me to realize is that reporting is never kind of objective and neutral, right? Because there's always a person who is doing reporting. Now, in addition to the person on the ground who was doing the reporting, there was also a whole bunch of other people who got involved in the process of international reporting. And this is editors and politicians and government officials in various ways and in different ways in the Soviet Union and the United States, but nonetheless, obviously audiences and their responses and a whole bunch of other people. So international reporting became this kind of collective process that had many participants in it who shaped the final product that then audiences engaged with.
I mean, there was a lot of political pressure on reporters at that time, as you lay out very well in your book, and that's because the two systems were competitive. One was the struggle for communism, trying to show that it was better than democracy and democratic capitalism.
The two systems were absolutely competitive, and also both of them, on the one hand, used international reporting to make sense of their own place of the world and to make sense of each other. And at the same time, they used the press as kind of the symbol of their own political system. So American journalists became the symbols of American freedoms and the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Soviet journalists became symbols of kind of responsible reporting that is not beholden to capitalist values. And also each side then looked at the other's journalists to kind of berate them and shame them and said, oh, look, American journalists are following the instructions of their capitalist bosses. Oh, look, the Soviet journalists are following the instructions of the Communist Party. So the press was very much part of the ideological confrontation and played a big role in it, both as a symbol, but also as something that created how people thought about and what people knew about the other side of the Iron Curtain. And for that reason, officials on both sides found international reporting incredibly important and wanted to intervene in international reporting in different ways. So, for example, everything that had to do with foreign correspondence was actually regulated and subject to all sorts of bilateral agreements. And we had periods where there would be visa wars. So Americans and Soviets would deny and withhold visas to each other correspondents because kind of in retaliation for each other. Journalists would be expelled because their reporting or journalistic activities would be unpleasing. This is something that Soviets did much more frequently. It was called.
So aren't you shocked? Aren't you shocked? You can just spin the clock forward to today, and that's happening again. In fact, the BBC reporter was just thrown out of Moscow. A visa was denied to a Russian reporter to enter the UK 2 years ago. There are visa wars, and there are accusations that foreign media is an enemy of the state.
I'm not as much shocked as perhaps maybe sad. I think my book shows very clearly that journalism matters and that foreign journalism matters, and what foreign journalists are doing in your country matters a great deal. And so this in itself is not new. We are living in this age that proves once again that countries look at foreign propaganda as a potential explanation for political developments back home, and actually associate foreign propaganda, blame foreign propaganda, and all sorts of things that are happening in domestic politics. So these developments are not in themselves new, and they are legacies of the Cold War period, I guess, that manifest themselves in these new different ways.
You wrote that Soviet journalists considered factual accuracy to be secondary in importance to the moral truth of socialism.
Yeah.
Did the Americans travel a higher road?
They traveled a different road. The reporting of US, the ethos of US journalism is actually premised on factual accuracy, right? So factuality is considered kind of the first duty of an American correspondent.
But that anyway, yeah.
Well, yes, and in fact, this is what I guess one of the things that make me sad, and kind of when I'm looking at contemporary media, is that factual accuracy becomes less and less important across the globe, no matter what your values are. So for American correspondents, factual accuracy was very important, and the way that they projected their values into their reporting or their ideas were much less obvious and much less conscious, I guess, than the Soviets did. So the Soviets were very open about using socialism as an interpretive framework, about using Marxism as a lens to understand American society. American journalists thought that the American way of life is a natural way of life, that this is how things are. And that then shaped the way they reported about the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union became this like really strange, unnatural thing that had to be explained and understood in also different ways for a Western reader who kind of shares.
And would an American reporter ever dare to celebrate any aspect of communism or socialism in this purely capitalist system back home? If he was to write an article that was positive about the Soviet system, I assume he probably wouldn't have had a job the next day.
That's absolutely right. They would have paid the price. And there was price to be paid for telling particular kinds of truths or expressing particular kinds of opinions. And people were kind of both readers and editors were very fast to berate journalists for what was perceived as a positive interpretation of the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. And you see this in the archives when somebody would publish, like a mild endorsement of something, and there would be readers writing letters and say, oh no, this is like gives the Russians too much credit and they really are not that great, and you forget how amazing the American system is. So some journalists actually thought at the time that readers were not ready to hear all what they had to say about the Soviet Union.
I mean, a lot of the Soviet journalists, when we start drawing parallels with American journalists and the pressures on both sides, they were in fact members of the security services, and some of them held rank. And you certainly, as far as I know, never ever had that with American journalists.
That's a super complicated one. So some Soviet journalists were members and did have rank. At the same time, in my understanding, and kind of this is a very tricky part of the story because we obviously don't have the archives. The KGB does not welcome historians into their fold. So from memoir literature and kind of interviews that journalists had done subsequently, I understood that the KGB was not allowed to recruit from Pravda, which was the party newspaper, and was discouraged from recruiting from Izvestia, which was the government newspaper, because in case these people got exposed, that would kind of tarnish the Communist Party or the Soviet government subsequently. So the practice of recruiting journalists was more prominent with all sorts of news agencies that the Soviets also had. Mm-hmm. But most of the people who are in my book were actually reporters for kind of Pravda or Izvestia, and this is that's my engagement with them. Americans were very worried about the CIA recruiting their journalists. And so if you look kind of at the correspondence inside the New York Times, for instance, they're really worried that the CIA might be approaching foreign correspondents And they knew that the CIA was approaching foreign correspondents in different places around the world. So they would hear about this from their journalists. So they were preoccupied with with this thing as well. And you're absolutely right. There's no way of knowing today, unless people, come out themselves, whether or not somebody was a spy. That said, I think that at the end of the day, it's not like that terribly important, in the sense that I'm interested in the press because the stories that journalists told shaped how people thought about the Cold War, about their country's place in the world, and the Cold War adversary, the rival superpower. And in that case, it doesn't matter whether you write the story as like a hidden, cloak and dagger CIA operative or Secret Service person, or just as a journalist. At the end, what really matters at the end is the representations that went out there and informed people's knowledge and worldview.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting reading your book, because I continually think to myself as I'm reading through parts of it. I didn't read cover to cover, but I read a lot of it. That because you come from the West, you start looking at what was taking place in the Soviet Union, not only from a Western perspective, but you kind of feed into that, believing that's what your readers want to hear about, or that's what your viewers want to know about. And the dog starts chasing the tail after a while. And it's the same with the Soviet reporters, I'm sure, who, in anticipation of trying to please their bosses, who were ultimately, could put them in jail if they didn't, if they threatened their own system or reported negatively on the other system too positively, is that after a while, even if those reporters could walk a more neutral path, in the end, you really do see in that book how people approach this already with a very kind of square lens, if I can say it like that.
Correct. Though people did try many people were very aware of how their own prejudices and backgrounds inform their reporting, and really made an effort to understand the other side. There was also a great deal of, I guess, creative reporting on the Soviet part, or efforts to they didn't just fall in line. They actually tried to circumvent these regulations, and they were pretty experienced in the system, so they knew how to do this. So like a seasoned foreign correspondent knew what would fly past the censor or what wouldn't. Or
I know you made an example in one, and it was really interesting, where one of the reporters, the American reporters you talked to, said that they used to kind of bury the lead, and then they would write about the same thing maybe 3 different ways, knowing that maybe one of them would get past the Soviet censor.
Americans were kind of terrifically clever about outsmarting the censors, and there's a great deal of efforts and ways to do so, but so were the Soviets, right? So the Soviets also tried to outsmart their censors, and sometimes they would just try to sneak things out, hoping that the censors wouldn't notice, or sometimes they would talk about things in such a way that they would hope that it would pass. So a lot of them, for instance, made an effort to talk about the 1960s, right? The public protests against the war in Vietnam, and the civil rights demonstrations and the anti-war demonstrations. So they lived in this very interesting, exciting time. And they were actually the first people to tell Soviet readers about, cool American stuff like hippies, and cool American stuff like all these kind of young activists, when they were doing the right thing, and just kind of dressing it in the right language would make it pass. But at the end of the day, what the Soviet reader was reading is, descriptions of 100,000 strong anti-government demonstrations, sanctions, and running in America's major cities, for example. And I think kind of just by broadening the horizon of what Soviet people knew about the United States and introducing them to these like vignettes of American daily life and American culture made a big difference.
Dina Fainberg has just authored the book, as I mentioned at the beginning, The Cold War Correspondents. And what's important here is that Dina also is a lecturer in modern history and the director of history a BA program, and her research explores the history of the Soviet Union, modern Russia, and emphasizes on the Cold War, late socialism, mass media, propaganda, and Russia's relationship with the West. And Dina, I know I'll make it into your next book.
Thank you.